Hello, students, and welcome to the start of the final unit for 12A, Quarter 2, Week 6. Today, we are going to cover the first two tutorials out of Unit 5. So we're going to be covering the Metaphysical Poets and the Roots of Neoclassicism tutorial lesson activities today. So the learning target for the first set, for the first tutorial on the Metaphysical Poets, is that you will be able to investigate the historical context of the metaphysical poetry, including its place in Jacobean and Carolinian England. So if you have not gone through the tutorial, please stop the video right here and go through it. You really need to understand the historical context to get some of the questions that you're going to be asked, especially on the test, but to sort of understand what some of these questions are going to be asking you for the lesson activities. So after we look over this lesson activity, we're going to play a little video that gives you some background on the metaphysical poetry, kind of helps out a little bit, and then we'll talk in depth about the actual questions. So for the lesson activity in this tutorial, we're going to look at the poem The Flea by John Donne, and then answer a couple of questions on it. And then we're going to look at another poem by John Donne and do some other stuff. So the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at The Flea, rewrite it in plain style, and then sort of enhance it, and then you'll make some comments on it. So let's go ahead and do this video real fast, get that going, and then we'll go over The Flea using the next video because it will help.
Discussing metaphysical poetry. So, metaphysical poetry starts happening around the Renaissance, which you've learned in your history class. This is a rebirth of learning. Poets are getting even more creative. Shakespeare is on the scene, so it's the 1600s, late 1500s. The metaphysical poets weren't even friends or anything, but this push for creativity during the Renaissance made metaphysical poetry what it was. The fundamental aspect of metaphysical poetry is that the work is characterized by the usage of conceits. Some of you may have had the word conceit on your vocabulary flashcards, so you know that a conceit is an exaggerated comparison. The conceits that these poets were using were extremely inventive, and usually the poems had to do with thinking about love or religion, or sometimes death. And like I said, this is going on in 17th century England, like Shakespeare, but he wasn't a metaphysical poet. Don't misunderstand me mentioning him in this video and think that he was. The metaphysical poets were using these exaggerated, sometimes grotesque comparisons as a sort of reaction against the overly elevated language of Shakespeare and other Elizabethan poets. Rather than comparing a woman to a blossoming flower, the metaphysical poets might have compared her to a more industrial tool or something equally as seemingly random. To break down the root of the word metaphysical, meta means above or beyond, and physical means earthly or concrete. So the metaphysical poets moved concrete symbols beyond their meaning into a more philosophical symbol, as we'll see in just a minute. So back to what a conceit is. If you haven't had conceit as one of your vocabulary words, it's kind of like a metaphor. It's an exaggerated comparison between two very unlike things. And in a conceit, the two things are so unalike that the reader doesn't even want to compare them. It's an uncomfortable comparison, but the poet skillfully makes the comparison acceptable to the reader. The way you unpack the meaning of a conceit is you pull out the associations you may have with the two things being compared. One example is this very famous poem, The Flea by John Donne, whom we'll talk more about in a minute. It says, "Oh stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare, where we almost, yea, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is." Okay, take a second to reread that. Pause the video if you need to. So in other words, what John Donne is saying here is,
so this is actually like part of what question 1 is asking us to do. So we're going to get another overview of kind of this, and I know that we won't necessarily watch the whole next video, but just so you're getting this idea, this is this idea of like breaking it down into more understandable English.
Oh, stay, or don't go. This little flea has my blood, your blood, and its own blood. And so our bodily fluids are already mixed in the flea, so we might as well have sex, even though we're not married. So John Donne uses this flea as kind of the idea of we're already mixed together in there, so madam, let's go ahead and get in bed. So the comparison between the flea and marriage is not one that you would normally make. If someone said to you that fleas are closely related to sex, you might laugh or think they're weird, but the metaphysical poets make it work. Once he's finished the poem, you can understand, like, oh, I can see how that would work. Going back to John Donne, it looks like John Donne or something like that, but it's pronounced done, like you're done with that assignment. His most famous poem is A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, which we'll examine a bit of later on. As I said, John Donne wrote during the late 1500s, early 1600s, so he was alive at the same time as Shakespeare. I'm not sure if they knew each other or not, but that would be neat if they did.
All right. Close that one. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're not going to go over the whole poem. So this sort of goes beyond what we will, but it really covers like what the poem is talking about. You get a little bit more background information. So I'm going to play it as long as it like covers what part of the poem we're looking at. So it's really just like this beginning of the poem, and then we'll stop after that, and then I'll go over it a little bit if there's more to explain. So yeah, this is like a 10-minute video. We definitely don't need it for the whole thing.
Okay, students, so we're going to do a quick video to catch up on the metaphysical poetry, poem by poem. So hopefully I have time to do one for each of these poems, certainly the most important ones. And just so if you've missed any of the notes, or if you've missed any of the lesson, or you're just not entirely certain on what the big ideas were for each of the poems, then you can refer back to these videos. So we're doing 5 to 10 minutes per one. I'm just going to go through the most important stuff. So John Donne's The Flea is sort of the first poem that we've dealt with. And what I'm going to just show you are some of the bigger ideas within this poem. So the first thing to say about this poem is structural. We want to be able to say something about the form, the structure of the poetry that we're dealing with. And so we can see that we have this is the, be, said, head, woo, to, and do. So something simpler we could say is we have it's repeated. We've got 3 groups of couplets, couplet, and then we have a triplet. So we have 3 groups of 2, and you have the threeness or a 3 similar sort of structure across the whole idea, sort of separation on the. A lot of metaphysical poetry. So a lot of metaphysical poetry will have a structure which is argumentative in nature. It's about getting to a conclusion. I don't mean an argument in the sense of me having to go at somebody else, but an argument that leads towards a conclusion. Something like this, something else, and then some sort of bringing together compromise or synthesis. So we can see that the first stanza is about sex. The second stanza is about love and marriage. And then the third stanza is essentially the reasons why one ought to act now. So it's about essentially this idea of the carpe diem. Sort of act now, live for today, and again return to this idea of sex and action at the end. And this is a really nice idea for our first poem, because to understand metaphysical poetry, you have to understand it's doing 2 sort of contradictory things, really. So,
okay, so this is really what we're trying to talk about in terms of like understanding this poem. If we need a little bit of understanding about what the poem is about to really be able to put it into plain English to understand it. So this is really where he starts like talking about how to understand the poem, and like I said, once he's kind of beyond where we're really looking at, we'll try and wrap that up.
Metaphysical poetry tends to be quite conversational. It tends to be quite monosyllabic or disyllabic in nature. It tends to be quite easy to use. It tends to be what we call quite lyric, often in nature. So just easy to read, nice like lyrics. It's got a sort of almost a spoken quality or conversational quality, or it might have some sort of lyric quality, a sense of an easygoing song or something like that. So it's quite down to earth. It's about sex. Some of the ideas in here are quite base. It's about, oh, look at this flea, it's enjoyed you more than I have, quite down to earth. But at the same time, it's about some huge philosophical ideas. So here there's a really big exploration of the concept of love, the concept of marriage in the metaphysical realm. And the key to understand this is this idea of the conceit, the metaphysical conceit.
So back to this idea. So I'm
is a metaphor for sex or the sexual connotations. And this flea are two bloods mingled. Little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first and now sucks thee. And absolutely, yes, those verbs are supposed to have sexual connotations. And this flea are two bloods mingled. B. Thou knowest that this cannot be said, a sin nor shame nor loss of maid and head. So essentially, it's natural for the flea to enjoy your body, and I want to too. Is what's being said by the poet here. It enjoys before it woo, and pampers was one made of two, and this, alas, is more than we would do. So there's a sort of ironic tone. It's a sort of sarcastic, ironic tone. It's quite conversational, quite monosyllabic. You can see that it's not a really overblown ornamental style.
This is something that's important to think about when we do the second part of the first question, is thinking about the word choice. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and that kind of helps out for the second question too. But when you think about like the words and talking about this idea of monosyllabic or one syllable words, very simple words, that's super important, especially when we get into that second question.
And the idea is that it's linking the flea to the physical act of love. So that's a physical metaphor, physical to physical. But once we get to the second stanza, we sort of raise the stakes a little bit. So, oh, stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare. So she's about to go and squish it, where we almost name more than married are. And this is something new. So before, we've had, in other poetry, we've had the flea being seen as a sort of metaphor for sex. But what we've got here is the flea as a metaphor for metaphysical love, for marriage, and for opening up questions about the sanctity of marriage and the relationship between nature and civilization. This flea is you and I. That's a huge claim. And this our marriage bed and marriage temple is, right? So if we take that sort of right in the middle of the poem, this and look, before it we have our marriage bed. That links to sex, but then marriage temple. And we get this new semantic field of temple. We've got married. We've got...
Okay, I think he's kind of going to go a little bit deeper for the rest of this than we really need to. The point is just to kind of understand like how the poem is structured, how it's brought up, and then how you can use that to sort of understand what the poem means and then do these tasks. So if we're looking at this now, what we want to do is rewrite it in a plain, easy style. So you can do this in a couple of different ways. I just sort of have like a summary, which I think is sort of part of what she did in that first video. She just sort of like summarized it, but it's pretty easy to do that way. Or you can go line by line and just sort of like plainly restate it, whichever way like works best for you. But essentially that first video really started covering what this is about. And so it's this idea that if you look at the flea, I'm not asking a whole lot from you, because like this flea already bit me and then it bit you, and then like now our blood is already mixed inside this flea, so we may as well have sex, is like basically what's the point of not? I mean, because we've both been bitten by this flea. So I mean, that's essentially like if you break it down into what it means. But yeah, it works really well if you break it down line by line too. Just a very clear explanation of what's happening. So that's what you're doing for part A, is just rewriting it in plain style. And then part B, this is why it's important to pay attention to the word choices that the authors have, because you're not looking at it and just writing it like plain and blunt like you are in part A, but now you're just going to replace some of the words instead. That way it's a little bit more clear, and you're not trying to make it like full of flowery and difficult language, but you're just trying to change what the language is, go for a particular style. So you are changing words, but again, you're not trying to find like big complex words, just pretty simply. And then for question 2, so this is asking you to do 2 different things. So the first thing is to look at this excerpt from the poem and notice the words. So it actually wants you to copy and paste the lines into your response below and try substituting some of the words with other words. So you're going to select this and copy, and then Control V or Command V. If you're on a Mac, it's Command. If you're on a PC, it's Control, so you can paste it. Because if you right click, it doesn't let you paste. And then you're going to go in and just actually replace words. So instead of thou, you can type in you, and so on and so forth. You want to try and keep the types of words the same. So modifiers, verbs. Okay, so that is the first task that you have to do, is the actual replacing of the words. Copy, paste, replace words. You don't have to replace all of them, but if you kind of want it to make sense, you can try it specifically. Then once you're done doing this part where you're replacing words, you're going to read the lines and then write a short paragraph. Doesn't make sense. You can kind of tackle this any way you want, but do try and keep the same types of words. But if you want it to make sense versus not wanting it to make sense, that's totally something you can do. You also don't have to redo necessarily the entire poem. You can choose certain lines. So like an example of redoing the first line and just replacing some of the words. I put down, you, cat, are much happier than humans. So as you can see, so I replaced thou, I replaced a noun, and then I talked about, the modifier of the amount of happy, so are much happier. Okay, I kept this same adjective, and then I changed the we pronoun into the specific noun, humans. So you can do stuff like that. And then you just explain kind of how it came up, and were word choices completely random, things like that. Would it have made sense if all the words were totally random? And then give yourself a self-evaluation and you're good to go. This one, it's really important that you do go through the tutorial, because a lot of this information comes up throughout the other tutorials, and then it's in the test. So that covers the Metaphysical Poets tutorial.